Thank you for coming back promptly. And now welcome Sue Swalwell, who's going to talk to you about women in the dock, lives revealed in court records. Sue grew up in North Yorkshire, where hooray! Where her curiosity about family, place and communities began. As caretaker of the family archive, Sue has studied her ancestors and their communities for over 40 years. She established a one-name study which explores the family surnames, origins, etc. Sue loves sharing forgotten stories and is an experienced speaker and writer on family and local history matters. So welcome to Sue.
Is that better? Yeah. I'm not, to be fair, I kind of feel like we should cancel my session and carry on with Donna and talking about AI, because I was fascinated by that one. So I hope I can generate at least a bit of interest in this one. The other reason I'm talking about this subject today is I hope all of you are aware it's International Women's Day, and therefore it seems important to acknowledge that we have women in our one-name studies whose stories also need to be told, as well as those who carry on the surname beyond marriage. Now, I believe that partly because I'm one of those stubborn people who never gave up my maiden name, because I've always felt that Swalwell is my identity. And fortunately, I married a man who understood, so it's fine. I also, when I first started doing my one-name study, I felt really conflicted, because everything about the one-name study says that actually I need to pursue the holders of the surname. And again, partly because I'm stubborn and a bit of a rebellion, I've never done that. I've always followed the Swalwell women who've got married and their families too. Because I think I certainly grew up in a household and a family of very strong, independent, northeastern women who ruled the roost. So all the things about women not having lots of records there, not being part of the running of a household, the culture of a family, I think are wrong. But I know women are difficult. They're difficult to research for lots of reasons. And I really wanted to show you, because I've spent a lot of time researching them, that there is a wealth of information out there that you can find out about them. So today I'm going to talk about the court records, because they're a very vital source for that. And I really hope at the end you're encouraged to actually try and rebuild some of the stories of the women in your family too. The reason the court is so important is because of the processes that the court goes through in any court case, or most court cases. One is, and it doesn't matter whether you're the plaintiff, the defendant, the victim, just a witness. They have a process which is really important and tells us a lot about all the individuals involved, because they really do focus on establishing and verifying identities, and not just identities at that particular point in time, but previous identities, to make sure they know exactly who they're talking about. They investigate in great detail the time, place, and circumstances of the events that have led that person into the court. They also question the nature of relationships, because understanding whether somebody is an impartial or a partial witness is a very important part of the court process. They also explore personality and character and events, not only in terms of their own perspective, but in terms of how those in the community think about them. So that can be quite useful in terms of insights into your ancestor too. And they also do a lot of stuff in terms of income and assets in many of the cases. So they're really exploring lots of detail in terms of the kinds of receipts, bonds, notes, all sorts of things, mortgages that people might have had. But also they often talk about community perception and community memory of what land was worth at certain points in time and what rentals it was worth. And so there are a whole load of stuff you can get from court records. Now, that's useful for everybody in our study, not just the women. But the reason it's so valuable for the women is that we all know the problem of the women. Before 1813, you were lucky if you got the mother's name mentioned. You might get her Christian name, you certainly wouldn't get a maiden name at all. Fortunately, Christiana only married once, so she only had 2 identities in her life. I'll go on to somebody much later who was much more complex than that. And it's also that the records that we're dealing with all the time just focus on the head of the household, as if the person behind that head has no influence. That is, unless you're like my 3 times great-grandmother, who took umbrage at the fact that her asses and her ponies had been actually put into the village pound and decided to release them. And so she appears in the newspaper because she got into trouble because she'd gone and claimed her asses and her ponies back. Now, unfortunately, this is a court case where I haven't been able to find any more depth about her or exactly what had led to her, but I do think it gives a glimpse of a character who was not afraid of standing up to the authorities. But then there are some cases that you find in the courts where you get some very detailed assessments of characters. This is from a church court record where Mary Ellaby, the wife, was applying for a separation from bed and board on the grounds of her husband's adultery and cruelty. The husband described his wife as a very spoilt child with a violent temper, one who neglected her duties as a wife and actually condoned and connived in his affairs. The deponents and the witnesses were all asked to comment on the character of the 2 people. And I think it's very clear from the statements that are said that actually the husband's assessment of the wife's character was not endorsed by the community. And that was true of whether they were brought, whichever side of the argument they were on, that was true. But not only in this record do we get a detailed account of their courtship, with the marriage, the breakdown of the marriage and the reasons for that. And so you get literally a stage-by-stage account of their marital relationship, and it makes for fascinating reading. And it is one of those stories that I'd love to use AI and ask them to do it. Can you do this in the style of EastEnders, please? It can also be incredibly intrusive. Because in order to prove adultery, there are lots of complex ways to prove adultery in those days. And one of those was actually somebody else having your child. And so one of his lovers was actually brought to the court. Now, by this time, she was a respectable married woman with her children from her husband. But these just give you an example of the questions she had to endure in the court and answer in the court in terms of the nature of their relationship. And it goes further than that. It actually asks about who attended the birth. Was it a doctor? Was it a midwife? Importantly, though, who paid for that attendance at the birth? Because if he paid for the attendance at the birth, that was seen as acknowledgement of parentage. But even if Mary had proved adultery, beyond all reasonable doubt, she would not have been able to get a separation from bed and board. Because actually, to be a woman, you had to have both adultery and cruelty. You had to prove cruelty too. So there are some really, really detailed descriptions, partly by Mary in terms of her claimed testimony, but also in terms of witnesses as to the physical attacks and the threatened shooting by William of his wife. And that, again, is kind of gold dust in terms of if you're trying to write a story or add a story to your ancestors. And again, questions of identity come up. Because, interestingly, Mary Ellaby, who was bringing the case, was known locally as Mary Stevenson before she was married. But the marriage entry in the parish register actually describes her as Mary Stevenson Calvert. So there's a lot of questioning about whether she was the same person. She is, and I know she is, because her father had actually been baptised as William Stevenson Calvert, but dropped the Calvert name before she was born. But that's how the licence had been applied for, in terms of the marriage licence they'd obtained. It had been got from the York courts in the Calvert name. And in that marriage licence application, they also declared that Mary was 21, that she had the consent of parents, and she was only 18 and the parents knew nothing about it. So there was certainly a level of deception going on, so I'm sure that's why the Calvert name suddenly got introduced into the records. But there was also a key witness in terms of the cruelty, was also called Calvert, Mary Calvert. So again, lots of the questioning was actually, was she truly an unbiased witness, and therefore could those claims be taken seriously? Fortunately for Mary Ellaby, they decided that the discussion of the relationship, which was actually, she said, yes, there is a relationship by my father and her father, but it's some distant cousin type relationship. So they accepted that and accepted her as an unbiased witness. And that's the other thing about court records, is they often give you clues to actually influence your future research strategy. Because I am actually related to Mary Stevenson Calvert and her husband and everything else, like her father and things. And I've no idea where the Calvert name comes from. So I've now got a whole strategy of trying to link those two Calvert families to help with my identity. But sometimes we get a woman has a very complex series of relationships or identities across her life. And this was the case with Elizabeth Swalwell. When I first started my one-name study, I did all the usual things of looking at places that were rich in names and went to the National Archives catalogue and looked for Swalwells. And actually, the Chancery records were dominated really by Elizabeth. Not the men in the family, but by Elizabeth. And I was fascinated by that because I just hadn't expected to see a woman feature in so many records at this particular point in time. There were a total of 4 cases. But as you can see, not all the catalogue entries are equal, because although all those cases are related and involve the same debate about who owns what land and what the legacies are, they come under very different names. So you have to be really careful in terms of how you research to make sure you find all the cases. And at the core of this, which I'll just get out of the way so you understand what's going on, basically there was 8 ox gangs of land in a place called South Loftus, where I grew up, which was under dispute, and that's about 140, 160 acres roughly. Now, the farm I grew up on was about 140 acres, so I'm still trying to find out whether it's actually the same land that I grew up on that they were arguing about. But it was also about inheritance, because one of the characters' fathers had left legacies to be paid from the use and possession of that land, and those legacies weren't being paid. So those are the cause of the actual cases that were going on. And just to show the process of the court case, which I don't know how many of you looked at Chancery, but Chancery records all have a very common procedure. The first thing you have to do is appoint a lawyer to draw up a bill of complaint to submit to the Chancellor, and that's known as the first pleading. Next, assuming that the defendant does decide to contest the case, and they didn't always, because they quite often settled, because a court case in Chancery is quite an expensive business, then they would actually respond with their kind of justifications or arguments or counter-arguments against what the actual plaintiff was saying, and that's known as the answer. And then it has to go through another iteration, so they get another chance. So the plaintiff gets another chance to respond to the defendant's answers to his first query, and then you get another process. And basically this process is trying to get to a point where it understands what all the issues in the case are, and to derive a set of questions or interrogatories that they can put to people and therefore decide an answer on the case. As the suit proceeds, each step or order is recorded in a plea and order book, which actually just a decree and order book, which actually records what was agreed at every stage. It includes details as well if there's been financial calculations made of actually assets, etc. And the final decree gives the final judgment or verdict. Now, not all cases go through all those processes for the reasons I've outlined. And what's really unique, I think, or pretty much unique, for the Elizabeth cases is actually it did go through all those processes. But not only that, for some reason, the master's exhibits, because normally at the end of a case, when it had all been finally decided upon, the master's exhibits, so all those receipts, personal accounts, inventories, would normally be given back to the people that they came from. For some reason, in these cases, they all got left in the court, and they all sit there in the master's exhibits, and they're a complete goldmine of information, of receipts, of inventories, of promissory notes and bonds. And that's really where it can be really fantastic to find something like that. First of all, though, I just want to demonstrate about this whole thing about identity and how that really helps you build quite complex trees from some of the court records if you follow it through. And these trees that I'm going to go through are only based on the information that was given in the court records. I've not augmented them with any parish research. I mean, I obviously have separately but to validate it, but actually this is just what they told me. Now, not each of the cases had everybody in the case, so I've done a bit of colour coding to try and explain how it works. So that red is the plaintiff, the person who brought this particular case. The purple is the defendant, so that's the person who was defending the case. Green just is those who all get mentioned in the case. And where I get onto the grey is because the family relationship has previously been established in a previous case, but they're not mentioned in the one that I'm currently discussing. The very first of these cases was when Elizabeth's son, eldest son, Roger, turned against her and took her to the Chancery Court. And that was largely because his father, when he died, had actually said that his eldest son was going to inherit most of the stuff, but he had to pay 3 legacies of £300 each to his siblings that was to be funded by the land that I previously talked about, which Elizabeth and her new husband claimed was hers because of a marriage settlement that she had. In case 2, Elizabeth has remarried, so it's her second husband, and this time it's her stepson who decides that she's trying to fiddle him, and takes her to court, and I'll go on and explain why, but it's basically she was made executor of his father's will. She did the inventory. She said he was worth nothing. Her son thinks he was worth a lot of money. So what we learn from that, though, is a whole series about that relationship and the children that were generated by that. You might think Elizabeth is quite an unpopular person by the end. You get to the end of this. In the third case, it's the brother-in-law. The brother-in-law of her sister that brings the case against Elizabeth, because her sister had been made an executor in the will of Elizabeth's brother, and this land from that will was supposed to be conveyed to her family. So how many people were giving away this land? I've no idea. So again, it was that, and so that brought them into the conflict with the Beckwiths. But 2 things that happened there was actually suddenly I find out a lot more about her as a child and her family and where she came from. But because she's now claiming there was a male entail on the land that she, in the last case, was saying she had because of marriage, she's then talking about the actual ancestors of the Beckwiths. And so we get lots of depth brought into it. So we have to go back to the generation that actually brought in the original male entail. But that's not enough either. Because in the case 4, this time it's her children that are bickering over the same land and the same assets. And this time it's her daughter and her daughter-in-law, because her two sons have died. So it's the only kids she's got left to inherit her daughter and her daughter-in-law. And they're arguing that Roger Beckwith has still not paid that £900 of legacy that was left in 1717 to them, some 35 years later. So they're still trying to get that money. But what we get here then, of course, is an extension of the family that's going on into the next generation. And that is quite a remarkable tree to get, and know that actually you can rely on it because it's been interrogated by the court. I could go further, because actually that wasn't the first time Elizabeth appeared in Chancery Court. She first appeared in Chancery Court when she was 15, because there was a legacy that she was due to receive from an uncle, which was £600, and that was being disputed. And there's about 6 different cases all about that legacy. But I thought if I carried on building trees, it would all get too complicated, and I think I've made the point. But because of the Masters exhibit as well, there's a lot to learn about Elizabeth's life. There are lots of receipts, and they're great receipts, in the Masters exhibits. So from that, we know that she wore ticking shoes, because I've got a receipt and a cost for those. We know that what medicine she took in her last illness, because that's all itemised out in terms of actually the receipt that was left as part of her estate. We know that in the marital home of her first marriage, there were 6 feather beds. But also, we kind of sometimes get to hear a bit of Elizabeth's tone of voice, because I have to say some of her statements do sound a little sharp and a little irritated with her family and the number of times they've taken her to court. And I'm not sure I can blame her for that. But we also get to know quite a bit about the circumstances of this married woman. So the inventories of the estates of her first 2 husbands, I'll go on to the reason why there isn't one for the 3rd husband later, are actually in all these Masters exhibits as well. So you get lots of detail. So her first husband was Newark Beckwith of Handale Abbey in South Loftus. And you would go, well, actually, she's made a good marriage, actually. Really promising marriage, because her family looked like they're only yeomans and he's part of the gentry. But in actual fact, when you start going through the Moon cases earlier, and this inheritance of £600, and the Moon land possessions, and the Moon family have actually started buying up Beckwith land, you start to realise it's actually a much more financial, land-based marital proposition than a proposal of love, I believe. And so it is much more equal, but her expectations and her status as being the wife of Newark Beckwith would have been quite high in the area. So whether she got a shock when he died, I don't know. But in terms of the financial situation when he died, it was not a good one. He borrowed lots of money. So he had debts in the form of a mortgage, which is the other complication of this 8 oxgangs of land, because in this, there was a mortgage on it, so somebody else entirely had some rights to it as well. So it's, there were bonds and notes, promissory notes, for over 250. Further bills to settle, there were wages outstanding, and as I say, there was this £900 legacy that had to be funded somewhere. Now, I can't work out whether Newark was reckless or not, or whether he was just land rich and cash poor, I've no idea. But he certainly wasn't alone in using bonds and promissory notes. It was really common practice in the area at the time. And it was how income was generated. And a lot of those bonds and promissory notes actually are women. They're spinsters, they're widows, who are lending money to Newark Beckwith of Handale Abbey in return for money at a 4.5–4% interest rate each year. And that was their income. She didn't, when he died, she didn't waste much time before she remarried. So she married Thomas Wilson just 9 months after Newark had died. And Thomas Wilson had been appointed guardian by her husband of her children, so it may have been a matter of convenience. They left Loftus, but they still obviously had the land in South Loftus that they was her part of her jointure. And this gives an indication of some of Thomas and Elizabeth's lifestyle. So we can see, well, they at least paid for newspapers and books, so I presume they read them. They drank coffee and tea. They ate cheese. They liked to drink wine, brandy and ale, which seemed to be alcohol seemed to be quite a significant expenditure. And they wore wigs. And as I said, this was an inventory that Elizabeth had submitted to the court. But this wasn't submitted until 9 years after he died. And the very last item in the inventory is the repayment of a debt to her own son, Roger, of £300, And that's not dated until 1735, which is some time after Thomas died. So I can get why her stepson was a little suspicious about her inventory and whether it was true. Certainly, if you look at just the lending versus borrowing picture, one would have to say Thomas Wilson, who was a cleric at Sneaton Church, was a more prudent man, certainly because he actually lent more than he borrowed, so I think that's more prudent. But the argument in here becomes about some building work that he's got. He owns some property in Whitby, which Elizabeth describes as being in a ruinous state, and that actually significant money was required to rebuild it in order to make the rental and get the capital and get the income. And she argues that during this, her husband and her son persuade her to give up some of her jointure. So they agree that they will release £300 from her marriage settlement in order to actually spend it on the property. And because of that, the property that Thomas Wilson owned in Whitby was put into a deed and transferred to her son and her uncle. So again, I think her stepson probably had a reasonable argument to make. Unfortunately, on this one, I haven't found what the agreement was at the end of the case, so I don't know whether the stepchildren ever got any money out of her. But she was very unhappy about it, in terms of it, because she claims that the property never made the kind of rental that made up for her giving away some of her jointure. She felt she'd made a very bad deal. But it's really the marriage to the Swalwell that, was probably the most disastrous one of all. She remarried just 8 months after Thomas Wilson had died, and married Richard Swalwell. And to be fair, he had married even in more haste because his last wife had only died 3 months before, and she was in fact his fourth wife, and he was 10 years her junior. He wasn't a local man, he was from Durham. He was a master mariner, and that was quite important at Whitby at the time. In terms of it, they're very influential, and they were kind of a bit like a new aristocracy in the town, really. And he did lots of dealing. So he went to Middelburg in Zeeland and made a very bad business deal, which is could be a feature of a whole new talk, because he left lots of detailed stuff. And so within 2 years of marrying Richard, Richard was declared an insolvent debtor and put into York Castle prison, where he died only 2 years after that, in 1730. And on his death, the administrator of his estate was actually his main creditor, Matthew Frankland. It wasn't Elizabeth at all. And basically, he had nothing to leave. So as an insolvent debtor, I'll go on to talk about a bankruptcy case later, but as an insolvent debtor, your creditors could leave you incarcerated in prison until they felt they'd been satisfied in everything they owned. So getting out was not an easy task in the world. But it was very negligible. And so, she'd gone from a young girl who, was expected to inherit £600. She'd been married to the Beckwiths. And here she was, having met Richard Swalwell, not doing quite so well. And in fact, when she died, the sum total of her estate was £12, 2 shillings and 8 pence. The total value of that was less than a quarter of her first husband's apparel value alone. So I can't help but thinking Elizabeth, by the time she got here, was probably quite a bitter woman and probably not overly fond of her family. The language also actually describes her possessions as old and worn. But she'd outlived 3 husbands, 2 sons, and had spent most of her life in Chancery. But I want to just talk about them because whenever we talk about cases, we tend to always talk about the plaintiffs and the defendants. These are all the names that are in the records of those Chancery cases, all the different families, all the different members of the community who in some way contributed and were part of this family's life and Elizabeth's life. They're people who were called as witnesses and deponents. They're people who are tenants and under-tenants. They're servants, they're neighbours, there's doctors, there's apothecaries, there's lenders of money, there's borrowers of money. And the interesting thing about it is a lot of them are the old of the community. So I think the oldest person who came as a deponent was something like 82, because a lot of the discussion was about the value of the land 50, 60 years ago. So if it wasn't the old who were doing it, then it was the descendants of some of the people who had owned and rented the land who were being brought to talk about what their father paid the rental for. What was that? And the other thing I should say is within that context, there are probably about 150 mentions of women in there, different women, tradeswomen, servants, and it's just a really rich source for community as well as for surnames. And if you want to have a closer look, I'll leave that out so you can check whether I've got anything about any of your surnames. So what happened to the case? Because you might be wondering, well, what happened? To be honest with you, I'm not entirely sure. There was a 3-day hearing held at which the court judged that the women were right. That actually both Elizabeth's daughter and daughter-in-law should be getting paid quite a lot of money by their brother-in-law, Roger. And that seems to be the end of it, because it's declared in the newspapers that it's all been settled. And the importance of the plea and order books, the decree and order books, is that's not always the case. So I went back to the decree and order books, and you do need to follow it from what appears to be a judgment quite a long way forward. Because literally every year, the women are back going, no, he still hasn't paid us, and the court goes the process of recalculating how much he owes, and it just goes on, and then it disappears. But there's no evidence anywhere that those women ever received that money, or indeed whether ever the court actually signed it off as a case closed. And I think that's probably why the master's exhibits are still there. So financial things for women is quite an interesting area to pursue, I think. And this one I want to talk about is about the Court of Bankruptcy. And another lady, but this time a single woman who was trying to make her independent life in London. And it's, you know, as Gwyneth talked about earlier, the London Gazette is a great place to, that's where you're going to find all the announcements of bankruptcy. And this is where I found Mary. And I'd followed this because I was quite intrigued, because when I started doing my one-name study, I expected, because of the distribution of a Swalwell name, I expected everything to lead me towards Northumberland and Durham, because I focused on the Yorkshire families to begin with, and found a Yorkshire family that led me to London. And that's how I ended up looking for Swalwells in London, and that's how I found Mary. So her bankruptcy was first announced in the London Gazette on the 20th of May 1828, and that's where you'll get all the legal notices, not only of bankruptcy but insolvency, deceased estates, breaking of business arrangements. And looking at the bankrupt directory that covers 1820 to 1843, which is on Google Books and Find My Past, so she was one of 3 schoolmistresses that year that was declared bankrupt, and 1 schoolmaster. And that's out of approximately 1,500 bankruptcy cases that happened. And the real role of this was just to let your creditors know that they needed to make a claim. So it was about making people aware that they could either appear at the court in person to make their claim, or they could submit a statement. And the court where Mary's cases was heard was in Basingall Street in London. And according to statute, 3 meetings had to be held within 42 days of that initial announcement. And I'll come back to that in a minute. And as Gwyneth said this morning, what happened is that it was published in the London Gazette, then the newspapers would just pick it up and do an abbreviated form telling people that, so that it was spread across the nation. So if she happened to have a creditor in Devon and was living in London, that person in Devon would still get to know about making a claim. But the announcement isn't the first start of the bankruptcy process. A commission of bankrupt had been awarded 2 weeks earlier on the 10th of May, And that was following a declaration made by 2 creditors on the 7th of May that they were going to pursue her for bankruptcy. And they would have supplied some information at that stage to the court about what debts she owed. But sadly, that isn't detailed in the docket book at the National Archives. It just declares that actually there is a commission of bankruptcy being awarded. And you can then see from this just how the meetings progressed. The first meeting was all about Mary surrendering herself to the court and the rulings of the court, and fully disclosing her estate and effects. On the May the 30th, the assignees who had established a claim would vote amongst themselves who was going to become the assignees. And the assignees is the person who the estate was given over to, and they were the ones who would make the decision who got paid what, when. In this case, the assignees were Thomas Slater, a butcher, and indeed a butcher from Kensington, who went on to supply Queen Victoria with her meat. So I suspect she might have been going to a too expensive butcher, and that might have got her into trouble. And there was John Becker, coal merchant. So those were the 2 assignees that actually became responsible for how her money and her assets got distributed. The good thing about being declared a bankrupt rather than an insolvent debtor is that your creditors, if you were declared bankrupt, could only make a claim on your assets to that point. Anything you earned after that was outside anything. They couldn't claim that money in terms of trying to get the dividend back. On June the 30th, the assignees decided on a course of action. And the other thing I should say is Mary's father had died by this point, I think about 2 years earlier. So they decided what they were going to do. They were going to sell Mary's property. They were going to have an auction of her property and assets. But they were going to keep the school running until the summer, because the parents weren't very good at paying in advance for education. They tended to do it at the end of the term. So they wanted to get the money from the students and the parents who'd actually been at the school up until that point. They needed to collect fees, therefore. They needed to pay the wages of the actual other teachers within it. But the main thing they were waiting for is for a mum to die, is really what the creditors were waiting for, because then they could get their hands on the reversionary interest. And at that point, her mum was 75. So, the expectation would have been that they wouldn't have to wait too long. There would be further meetings that year, which didn't really involve Mary, because they were more about auditing the accounts and agreeing what dividends to be paid. There is an ad in the Morning Herald on the 11th and 17th of June, advertising the auction of the fixtures and effects of a ladies' boarding school at Kensington Gravel Pits, as instructed by the assignees, so suggesting that the auction has been triggered by a bankruptcy. Now, I've looked everywhere to see if there are any other bankruptcy around Kensington Gravel Pits that this might be for. I can't. Therefore, I'm fairly certain that this is the auction of Mary's properties and effects. But I can't be certain because it doesn't mention her name. It again, is a wonderful piece of interest in terms of what it tells you about what was in the school. And also the scale of the school. So 29 beds. Now, not all of those would have been for the kids. There would have been some staff and things who probably that included as well. There's quite a lot of musical instruments, so it gives you some clues about the education emphasis as well at her school. Several hundred books, so her description as a bookseller in the bankruptcy notice is very much there. And then the bad news. So I was quite excited at this point. But then only about 5% of the case files of any bankruptcies actually survive at the National Archives. So I thought, well, I've got to find another strategy. How do I find out what she would have gone to? How do I work it out? So I stepped sideways and found another bankrupt schoolmistress, about the same time, still in London, so broadly going to be similar to Mary, not exactly, because she did slightly different things. Because I wanted to know what documents I'd lost. What would I have had if Mary's case had been kept? In this case, the schoolmistress was Jane Cass of Vauxhall, and she, commission of bankruptcy was declared on the 24th of January 1829, so not that much, only about a year later. 5 commissioners were assigned to her case. You could have as many as 7 commissioners on a case at any one time. The meetings took place at the same place as Mary's. And interesting, her main creditor was a coal merchant too. And he was appointed the single assignee in Jane's case. And actually Jane, according to the records, owed this coal merchant £188, 5 shillings and 6pence, which seems a lot, quite a significant amount of coal, really. But anyway, but it got me wondering what had happened before, and unfortunately you don't get a lot of detail about it. But part of being declared a bankrupt was you had to prove an act of bankruptcy, which basically meant trying to avoid paying the debt. And so there's quite a lot of, what had led up to it. So there is a witness who's called in this, who talks about the fact that Jane actually ran away from her home at one point in January because she was scared of being harassed by her creditors. Now, that might have been a staged thing, because that would prove an act of bankruptcy, or it might have been a real thing. But what you start to get is some really interesting financial information. And picking up on Gwyneth's talk earlier, if I get near financial information, I get really excited, which is very sad. And it's interesting because it might explain why it was a coal merchant and a butcher that were Mary's assignees, because the most significant sums that were owed by Jane was also a coal merchant and a butcher. She owed money to the coal merchant, the tailor, the tallow chandler, the baker, the bricklayer, bookseller, the grocer, the hosier, the glover and hat maker, the cheesemonger, the butcher, and others. So quite a lot. So I'm sure there were a lot of people knocking on her door most days. And basically the other thing that was happening during the same period is the costs of the bankruptcy itself was accruing against her name. So you were getting solicitors' bills being added, you're getting the fees for holding the auction being added, you're getting servant wages being paid, you're getting messengers being paid. Interestingly, in this one, the windows were broken at an auction, so I don't quite know what happened at the auction, but it sounded like it got a bit out of hand. Jane herself was also paid an allowance, so I suspect that Mary must have been as well. And in this case, she got £1 10 shillings a week, which the national currency converter equates with 1 week of a skilled workman's wage at that time. So you get some really interesting stuff about what is happening and what's going on. But where they're trying to get to is arriving at a balance sheet in terms of that's really what the process is trying to do. And I bet you can all sit there and think and understand why I'm so frustrated that Mary's case papers aren't in the Ruddy National Archives, because I would really love to have had this information for her. But it does give you some interesting things about the income and the expenses that a schoolmistress was actually experiencing in her work and her life. And during that, it gives you some indication of things like how much a master was being paid, music masters, dancing masters. And that also gives you hints about the type of thing that they were teaching as well. What it doesn't explain, though, and it never does, is how she arrived at this predicament. And the other thing that happens as well is anything that actually appears in the future will still always keep Mary as being at the Kensington gravel pits in 1828. So all future notices, even if she moves, still refer to that point, because that's the point of closure of the bankruptcy. So how did she get here? Well, I had to resort to normal methods, but I wanted to go through this to say, look, there were loads of clues for me in the court cases about Mary, because it gave fathers' names, mothers' names, etc. So I've been able to pursue those and try and answer a bit more about how she got there. She came from a family who were firmly established as citizens of London in terms of it. So she had, they were all members of the Citizens of Guilds. There's lots of evidence of wealth in the family. So John Style, let me check, her grandfather, I think it is, actually has an inventory in the Court of Orphans book in the city, and that actually is worth about £190,000 in today's money, that inventory. Hugh Hunt, another of her grandfathers, is leaving silver punch bowls and silver this and silver that all over the place to people in his will, and is also demanding that for his funeral there should be 2 coaches and pulled by 4 horses that take him to his funeral in Eltham. So I think she probably had quite a reasonable lifestyle. There's also insurance records which talk about how much her father was insuring the family home for, again, which suggests wealth. But it was actually a family of independent women, because the men kept dying early and the women chose not to remarry and keep their hands on the lucre. And basically they continued their business. So the women, carried on. They were described as consort citizens. They appear in apprenticeship records as masters, and they're signing the master's agreement in it. They're in the land tax rolls. Land tax rolls for women are invaluable. They appear regularly in the 4th Street area of Cripplegate, which is where they lived. And then she's got her cousin Martha, who at the age of 17, with the assistance of her father, who did put his daughter on the stage, they ran off to Hull, which is where I found them in the first place, and joined the Yorkshire Theatre Company, which was run by, I've forgotten his name now, Tate at that time. And that's really a less than conventional role for a young cousin who was 8 at the time, to think, well, I've got all these independent, strong-minded women in my household, got people on the stage. What am I going to do with my life? Am I going to get married, or am I going to stay independent? Now, of course, I've no idea whether she was ever asked. She might have decided she didn't want to marry. She may never have been offered. But it's interesting that she chose to try and make an independent life for herself. And to be honest, there probably wasn't much alternative other than being a schoolmistress. And we find, I've gone too far now. So we find her in Hackney, and that's the first school that I've found for her. And it's a boys' boarding school in Middlesex. So it's kind of a household size was given as 15 in the 1811 census. It features in the land tax records between 1810 and 1817, and she insures it. So the insurance records are really useful as well in terms of the women. And there are lots of schoolmistresses in Hackney. It was the school area at the time that she was here. There was loads of them. And they've all got insurance. So again, it's a great resource in terms of actually finding about the women in our families. And then, as you do, on a Saturday evening when your husband's watching the football or the rugby league or whatever, you start playing around on Google. So I just put in to see if I could find anything about Mary, and found a biography by one of her students who'd attended her school in 1809. I have to say he wasn't entirely complimentary about Miss Swalwell's schooling, which may be why she went bankrupt in the end, I've no idea. But he does give some items that his parents paid for in that period, which you can see here. And he does describe some of the lessons: music, dancing, fencing, broadsword, French, writing, spelling, military exercises, and gun is how he describes it. So I'm quite not sure whether they're doing that. There's also interesting entries like wine. So I'm not entirely sure about the wine for a 7-year-old, although somebody did suggest it might be communion, but I don't know. And broken windows, which may explain what she did next. There's also a seat at chapel. Now, whether that's her predisposition in terms of religion, I don't know, although there's lots to suggest that her family were nonconformist, or whether it's actually her the choice of the parents. And what I should say is this pupil became a famous comedian, and his parents were on the same theatre circuit in Yorkshire that her uncle was. So I am sure that her uncle up in Yorkshire was quite a good source of boys for her school. But she relocated to Bread Street Hill, and I think the Broken Windows had decided that she was going to actually have a girls' school rather than a boys' school now. And again, it's the Sun Insurance records which are really useful in terms of this, because again, it gives you an indication of different educational emphasis. Her insurance is covering much more musical instruments in this one than it was in the boys' school. What we don't know, really, is why she went bankrupt in the end. So all I've got is a theory. Her uncle and her father both died in terms of it. They obviously entrusted her and rated her because her uncle, in terms of his will, left her as guardian of his grandchildren and executor of his estate. But for some reason, in 1828, she decided she was going to move to Kensington. Now, this is a period when Kensington Gravel Pits was about to be turned into Notting Hill, effectively. And the Ladbroke estate was just starting to be developed. And I suspect she thought she would get in early and kind of there'd be a good business. The only problem was the development of this estate wavered. It didn't happen as quickly as it was supposed to. And I therefore think that actually she moved into an area before it was ready for a school to be there. So, it's not until 1847 that her mother obliges and dies. And that's when she reappears in the London Gazette. Now, the statute says that everything should be resolved within 18 months. So this is quite a record, I think. But it reappears, and it's because the creditors can then come back and claim some of the money from the reversionary estate. So that another dividend is paid, but in many of these cases, the dividend was no longer being paid to the original creditors. It was actually the descendants of the original creditors, because the original creditors had died waiting for their money to come back to them. She moves to Cheltenham, and at the age of 80 is still teaching, she claims. I've also got her at the age of 83 still being involved in the blind school in Gloucester, but then she moves back to London. And she died on the 12th of January 1863 in Lansdowne Circus, South Lambeth. It's really interesting, isn't it? Because there's lots of documents about schoolmistresses, and there's some parliamentary reports and things and projects that look at the state of schoolmistresses in this period. And in one of those it says, the schoolmistresses whose schools seldom survived them and were usually soon forgotten. I've no idea whether it was Mary soon forgotten. Certainly in terms of if you take her cousin's family forward, there are lots of school teachers and governesses within that family, and she spent a lot of time with them, and I think she did pass on to that family and those descendants a love of teaching. So God bless Mary Swalwell. And that's it really. I just wanted to demonstrate that you can find out, you can rebuild the stories of the forgotten women of our families, and I hope I've inspired some of you to do that.
Oh, thanks very much there. Fascinating. Okay, do we have any questions from the audience, please? Okay. Well, it appears not.
I don't know whether that's a good sign or a bad
No,
sign.
yes. Hello.
Are you thinking about writing this all up somehow, getting a blog or something?
Well, as I say, I think AI in the style of EastEnders is what I'm saying. No, I do want to, and it's one of those ones that I really do want to do, because I think because actually, they're not my ancestors,
doesn't matter, does
No,
it?
it doesn't matter, and it should be out there so that people who are related to them to something can find it, because there's a lot of detail. And and I've gone through a fraction really of the information I've got here today, really, because it's just fabulous.
These are the stories that I think are just brilliant over the years, and if we can document them and put them online somewhere, then people can read them.
I know.
Really cool.
I just need to point to, I need to decide which is my favourite to start with, and that's always hard.
Yeah.
On the records.
Oh yeah, no, it's fabulous, and I am still investigating the earlier cases. So I will do a presentation at some case about her childhood in the Chancery Court as well, because there's a lot of lovely inventories there, and includes estates in the Caribbean and everywhere. So it's.
So you mentioned obviously the Chancery cases, but if you've got court cases that didn't go to Chancery, if they were dealt with at a local level, where do you find those records?
I would go to things like quarter sessions,
The county archives.
county archives, petty sessions. In terms of that, assize records are at the TNA. If you get a case that went to the assize records, there is lots of documentation. You'll find crime. If one of your ancestors has committed murder, you might find a crime scene drawing of it. Because I nearly got sidetracked into a rabbit hole, finding a lovely kind of A3 drawing of the crime scene, exactly where the bullet hole that had missed had hit the wall, and where the person. So the records are there, but they also have amazing detail. Like you can find there as well. The expenses of the judge that was involved in the case, because all the expenses that the judges submitted and everything else. So you can find lots. Some of them are quite harrowing. So there are a couple of cases of sexual abuse of girls named Swalwell, sadly. And actually they give testimony at the age of 8 and 6, and they're in the quarter session records, and it's quite harrowing.
So basically petty sessions, quarter sessions is local, and anything above
Yeah.
the courts is TNA.
Yeah, that's what the other thing is the other place to look as well is actually in the petty sessions in the what they call bastardy books, which I don't really like using that word. But I went to look at those. I didn't find any Swalwells there, but I kind of was just being nosy really. And actually I found letters sandwiched into the books, which were between the father, the reputed father, and the mother, talking about their relationship and arguing about it. Some of which was quite personal and insulting to the woman. Some of which were actually quite nice, and you just kind of felt there was a reason they couldn't be together, but there was some kind of affection there. So
Is that TNA or is that
that's local record office as well.
mentioned the Masters exhibits. Now I'm familiar with some. I've done a bit on Chancery Records, but are the Masters exhibits attached? I wasn't quite clear where.
No,
you
it's a
find
separate
them.
area. It's a separate. I need to try and remember. No, so there's a different reference.
Is it a different C number? Is that it?
Yeah. So these are all C111. So C111s were mine, and it's a different area. So you also need to know the master's name. So, because they're actually listed under the master who sat on the thing, and you'll get that from the ordinary Chancery records. And then you need to look in the master's lists, which are separate, and then they'll have the master's exhibits.
Okay, so you can follow it through from the original, because I know the Chancery records are name-rich, aren't they? You can
Yeah.
look up all sorts of names, but then you have to follow the master. Okay, thank you.
Yeah, so it's separate. But the other place to try is the University of Houston has a website as well, where they've transcribed some Chancery records and stuff. And so that's quite a useful place to look at.
Thank you.
Place you would first think of, though.
No, it's not, no. No, it took me a while to find that, but yeah, no.
Okay.
I don't know if you're aware, but the Guild has a website, Women's Stories, which any Guild member can add. I think it's Marie Byatt and Marilyn Astle who run it. But any Guild member can put a story of a woman on there.
Yeah, it's finding the time to write it. But now I've got GB Chat. It'll be there on Monday.
Okay. Any other questions? We'll have a short comfort break now, 5 minutes to go and stretch your legs. One thing I had forgotten to mention is if anybody wants any empty files